Welcome to the Quantum Biology Collective podcast, where we break down the practical strategies of this emerging science, starting with healthy light habits and going wherever the quantum superhighway takes us. This is your host, executive and life coach Meredith Oak, with a quick reminder that podcasts are conversations, not consultations, and definitely not medical advice. We're here for informational purposes only. To follow up with our amazing guests, please do check out the show notes, and to stay in the loop with the QBC podcast, join our email list, also linked in the show notes. All right, my beloved quantum biology nerds, we're back on the science bandwagon. I know that's what a lot of you are here for, and you skip everything that doesn't seem like it's going to be jam-packed with scientific info. So this one is. My guest today is Bob Fosbury. Bob is an astrophysicist. He is retired, and he has now dedicated his life to interdisciplinary research, especially in terms of how light affects biology. So this is really exciting, as I think the academic silos that exist in science are starting to crumble. And as people reach points in their careers where they just don't care anymore, or they're retired or whatever, they're more and more willing to experiment and cross the lines. And Bob Fosbury is doing that. And he is bringing us so much rich information, especially on the topic of infrared light. And also due to the portal that podcasting is, he has come in contact with Scott Zimmerman. So if you haven't listened to that episode, that would be a great partner to this one. And Bob Fosbury and Scott Zimmerman actually did an interview together on Cameron Borg's podcast called, I believe it's called Nico Flow. So check that out if you enjoy this as well. Because I think the work that Bob's doing is extraordinary. And I really appreciate that he takes the time to talk to us non-scientists and explain it to us in a way that we can understand. And you can tell that he has a very, very deep level of understanding because he is able to do that. You know, I think it's a sign of true genius to be able to explain complex things in simple ways and bring it back to the fundamentals. So even if you are not a science nerd, this is still going to be interesting. And just to set the stage, I'm going to quickly read you Bob's bio because it's pretty fun. Okay, so Bob Fosbury is an astrophysicist who worked nearly 30 years for the European Space Agency on the Hubble Space Telescope and in the early years of the James Webb Space Telescope. His research interests range from exoplanets and stellar atmospheres to supermassive black holes in radio galaxies, quasars, and star formation in the early universe. He is currently an emeritus astronomer at the European Southern Observatory in Munich and Chile. After retirement, he was invited to become an honorary professor at the Institute of Ophthalmology at UCL, where he works in an interdisciplinary team to study the interactions of light with biology, following a lifelong interest in mechanisms of natural coloration. Oh, doesn't that make your heart sing? Okay, so here is my interview with Bob. And quick reminder to check out boncharge.com, enter QBC in the code as the code at checkout for 15% off. And remember, you can change your life just by turning off your overhead lights and buying a little clip-on red light. I recommend Boncharges. Truly, it's life-changing, just that one small thing. So if there's someone in your life who's worried about how annoying it is to be circadian optimized, maybe get one for them. Just little red light clip on your book as you're reading at night instead of your big bright LED. And who knows what could happen. All right. Enjoy, everybody. Thanks. Hello, Professor Fosbury. Welcome to the Quantum Biology Collective podcast. Delighted to have you and to meet you.
I'm looking forward to it. Yes.
All right. So I have to tell you, you are definitely the first astrophysicist that I have ever interviewed.
Well, I hope it's not too scary.
Well, it's a little intimidating, I will say, but you're very kind and charming, so I think we'll be
Mm.
fine. So tell me a little bit about your background as an astrophysicist. You worked with NASA, you worked on some of the telescopes that we've all heard of, the very, very famous ones. But lately there has been a bridge from that work into the world of light, biophotons, infrared light, quantum biology. Tell us how that bridge opened up for you and what you see as the link between those two fields.
Yes, this is an interesting issue which concerns multidisciplinary science, and I'll start off first by saying that I'm aware through my scientific career that many scientists work in very narrow fields, and this is almost necessary for people to get into have a successful scientific career because they have to publish and establish a reputation and so on. And so it's very different to broaden out into a much bigger picture of science that perhaps we had in the Enlightenment and the science that went on at the end of the 19th century. So I won't go into any detail in my astronomical career, but I started in the late 1960s in the Royal Greenwich Observatory in Herstmonceux in Sussex in Britain. I mean, this is when the observatory had moved from London into clearer skies in the south of Britain. And I studied astronomy there in conjunction with the University of Sussex. And that's where I got my DPhil, my PhD. And then I had the luck to being appointed to one of the first research fellowships at the Anglo-Australian Observatory, which was then just being finished in Australia. So we had one of the first 4-meter telescopes in the Southern Hemisphere, brand new. And so I started my career essentially working with an amazing telescope in a brand new hemisphere for big telescopes. And that was very exciting. But then I went on and I got involved with the European Southern Observatory, which is based in Munich in Germany, but obviously has big operations in the Atacama Desert in Chile. And I was a research fellow there for a while. And after working a bit in Britain, I actually went back to the European Southern Observatory, but actually working for the European Space Agency on the European side of the Hubble Space Telescope project. And in fact, I worked on that for nearly 30 years. I mean, 26, 27 years on the Hubble project from before launch until it had been up for a very long time. And it's still going,
Wow.
amazingly. So that was also very, very exciting. And of course, I had a lot of contacts with NASA there. We had the Space Telescope Science Institute in Baltimore, and I was often over there. And so I had, both working level contacts and some fairly high level contacts with NASA on the project. Then I spent a while working on the early days of the James Webb Space Telescope, the concept for the James Webb and the choice of instruments and so on. But then really went back to Hubble and moved away from the James Webb exercise. But when I finally was kicked out of ESA, the European Space Agency, when I was 62 or something, they kick you out early in ESA. I made a decision actually. I'm talking now about interdisciplinarity. I made a decision to move beyond astrophysics, not just go on doing what I was doing before, which was, of course, very exciting, but to try and learn more about other things. And by a series of accidents, I got involved with, the Earth and origin of life and geology and things like that for a while. But I got in contact with somebody called Professor Glenn Jeffrey at UCL, whom have been working closely with for a decade now, and he was working on vision. So my first project with him was studying the eye of the Arctic reindeer, or caribou, as you call it. And we discovered that the eye was changed its form between summer and winter by tuning a photonic crystal in its eye. And that was very interesting. We published that. But Glenn was working on the interaction of light with the retina in a medical with a medical perspective, and was realizing that the interaction of red light and far red and infrared light with vision was very beneficial.
Mm.
And so I got interested in that topic, and that was where I added my astrophysical perspective to his visual neuroscience perspective. And we were in contact with biologists as well, of course. And so we ended up with a very multidisciplinary team, including Scott, who's an optical engineer, Roger Schwelt, whom you now know,
Mm-hmm.
I now
Yeah.
know, who's a medic. And we have
Yeah.
a biologist in City University in London called Mike Powner. So we have a very multidisciplinary team, and this has allowed us to look at some of these problems in, I would say, quite a novel way. And we're trying to get this idea over to medics, to biologists, and to lighting manufacturers and to architects. And I have to say, we've had the most success getting these ideas over to the architects, because they feel they can do something about this. They can design buildings and lighting systems differently. And they're very interested in making healthy environments for humans to live in. And so they're
Right.
extremely receptive to what we're saying. Whereas the
Oh,
medics and biologists tend to be very conservative and think we're talking complete rubbish sometimes. But anyway, so this is this sort of melee that we're in
interesting.
at the moment. But we are looking at things in a very broad perspective, a very multidisciplinary perspective. And we're not necessarily going into all the details and all the individual
Hmm.
areas. We're not
Hmm.
equipped to do that. But we can see the relevance of these areas, and we can identify some of the problems that do have to be studied in much more detail. So I think you can kind of characterize to what we're doing as a generation of a broad, big picture perspective of the way light interacts with life all the way through. So the whole system, from sunlight coming in to the biosphere, what it does within the biosphere, and how it gets out afterwards and gets sent off back into outer space. So that's what we're going to be talking about.
This is absolutely fascinating. And I just want to acknowledge that you were able to step out of your very long and distinguished specialty and say, let's have some fun with some other fields. I mean, this is amazing. I remember when I read Jim Al-Khalili's book,
Yes,
I have to admit, like, the details escaped me, but the key essence that I took from
yes.
that was how radical it was for him to be talking to a biologist and how I really just could feel the courage that it took for them
Yes,
to take that risk and step out.
yes.
And in that academic world, I understand that it's,
It's very exciting. And in fact, I'm now sort of involved with the Guy Foundation.
yes,
You know about the Guy Foundation.
wonderful.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, I've joined their faculty, and we discuss these things now, and it is very exciting. I think there are very new things coming up, and
That's
yeah.
wonderful because we have some people who teach, who sort of extrapolate the most practical aspects of this and teach it to health coaches and so a handful of doctors,
Mm,
naturopaths, things like that, people who interact with clients and patients on a day-to-day
mm,
level, and they're all going to come and study at the Guy Foundation as well. So
yeah.
um, yeah, I just, you're pioneering a new world, and I think we're all benefiting. So thank you for that. And so then let's get into it. So you mentioned about bringing these ideas to the lighting industry, to architects, to different people. It's wonderful news that the architects are excited. I mean, it just
Mm.
anywhere to get the ball rolling. When you say we're bringing these ideas, so tell me what it is that you have come to believe or come to hypothesize about the role of light and life.
Right. Well, let's start with identifying the reasons that we're worried about this now. We have a problem, and this problem has only been revealed very recently over the last several decades. And I think, we now it's fairly common knowledge that that we're worried about lighting, artificial lighting, and so on. And I think we have to understand that life is a process that has evolved on our planet and maybe on other planets, but on our planet over a period of between 3 and 4 billion years. And it's been through a number of stages. I mean, the early Earth was very different from the Earth now. It didn't have any oxygen in the atmosphere, for instance. And the whole evolution of the Earth, not just the biological evolution, has been very dependent on the presence of life on the Earth. It's very closely intertwined with geology and all of these processes, the atmosphere, meteorology. I mean, all of these things are very closely linked together. So I don't any longer think of life being a set of individual species. Life is the biosphere. The planet Earth is alive. It's a system. And I would even argue that we go back to the original James Lovelock idea, the early idea of Gaia, and the fact that life and the state of the planet are very closely intertwined. I think they are extremely closely intertwined. So there's a whole story that goes on, when life started, possibly in the deep ocean vents. We don't really know yet for certain, but it very quickly realized that sunlight was going to be its principal source of energy. So I think we all accept now that life, at least the life we know any close to the surface of the planet, where it can access sunlight, is effectively entirely driven by sunlight via photosynthesis initially. I mean, the cyanobacteria in the oceans generating all the oxygen over, a billion years or so before it started leaking into the atmosphere, the oxygen leaking into the atmosphere and allowing life to populate the land as well as the oceans. So that was going on, and things were evolving, and the Earth had managed to retain life all through this very long period when many things were changing. I mean, the sun was getting more luminous, the atmosphere was changing, the geology was changing, and so on. But we have maintained an environment within which life can exist through this entire period. And of course, life has evolved to adapt to the resources that it has available. And, its principal resource is light. And so it will have adapted to make every possible use of light that it can. And we're rather fixated on photosynthesis because we see this happening. We see that plants, they crystallize their forms out of the air from just water and carbon dioxide and sunlight. And the products of the plant living, first of all, to build itself, it has to make biomolecules in order to build itself, but it also makes something that we can use as food. And so the animals are basically parasites of plants. They thrive on food coming from photosynthesis via plants, and we as humans have learnt to use the fossilized foods as well, the gas, the coal, and the oil that have all originated from photosynthesis. So, we are in a sense parasitic on plant life on the Earth. The botanists will love that, but the geologists will hate it. Anyway, that's the way it is. I don't think there's any argument about that. So, when I left my sort of astrophysical activities and started thinking about this, the first question that came into my mind, okay, we know how visible light is used for photosynthesis and to make food and so on. So what's the rest of the solar spectrum doing for life? What's its contribution? And some of them are well known and obvious. I mean, we use ultraviolet light to break bonds in cholesterol to make vitamin D. And we learned a lot about vitamin D during the COVID epidemic. And Roger Schell, of course, played a big role in this, in understanding that sunlight was very important for COVID recovery.
That was
Uh,
amazing work that he
it
did.
is, it is, it is amazing, but in a sense, it's not surprising because you know, I think his move was very clever. He suddenly realized that it wasn't vitamin D that was the really important thing. It was the fact that vitamin D was a proxy for having been in sunlight. So all the
Mm-hmm.
people who came in with rich in vitamin D had been sitting in the sun, and they were the people who survived.
There it
So
is.
it's a beautiful it's a beautiful realization where you start off on one track and you think, well, it's all vitamin D doing all the work, but actually, you know, vitamin D is very important, but actually it's the sunlight that's doing all the work. So then the question is, you know, okay, the ultraviolet's used for vitamin D, it's important and so on, and there are all issues to do with that. But what about the longer wavelengths? And that's the interesting one, and that's the thing that we have to try and understand in more detail. And I think I would like to, what I'm going to say today is there are two aspects to this. One is how this light gets into the body. You know, plants have two-dimensional structures. They have leaves. They're very, very thin. So the light only has to travel a tiny distance within the leaf before it gets absorbed by chlorophyll or one of the other chromophores in the leaf, and then goes off down these photosystems to make carbohydrates and food and so on. We're three-dimensional. Animals are three-dimensional. So how does the light get into the three-dimensional structure and play a role in biochemistry? And you know, in the beginning, we didn't understand this at all. I think we're now understanding it much better, and I have to give much credit to Scott for this. We worked very closely on this over the last year or so. But this is absolutely fascinating, and it's very, very beautiful. And I realized I've studied glass objects for years now, which I think are absolutely beautiful. These are opalescent glass.
Oh, it's gorgeous.
And I'm sure you can buy these in all these rock shops that sell rocks and so on. They sell bits of opalescent glass. And they're almost like a perfect model of the Earth's atmosphere. They generate all the twilight colors. If you look through them, it doesn't show up on a screen very well because the colors, you can see that looks blue.
Yes.
But if I shine light through it, which I can probably do, if I shine light through it,
Oh, yes.
it
It's
looks red or orange.
yeah.
And this is the orange of sunset. So this is a scattering. This is a model of light scattering in a transparent matrix. And this is a very good model of the body. The body scatters light very, very strongly, much more often than in the visible part of the spectrum. It scatters infrared light. And this is very fundamental physics, very basic physics. In the visible part of the spectrum, you get lots of pigments, chromophores in light. You know, the obvious ones are hemoglobin, blood, and chlorophyll in plants. They're strong absorbers of light. And the absorption of light of particular colors makes them colored. So leaves look green and blood looks red and so on. And that's because the visible light has enough energy in its photons to excite these pigments to excited levels.
Okay.
And the colors that are absorbed in doing that produce the colors, the pigments, or if you want to be technical, they're called chromophores, but I think of them as being pigments. As you move into the infrared, you basically lose the pigments. The photons don't have enough energy to excite the electrons high enough in the pigments to generate color. And so you kind of run out of pigments and you run into an entirely new regime when it's more or less at the point when your vision stops in the red. You can see into the red, but you can't see further. And the reason you can't see further is the reason that there aren't any pigments. There's no pigment to make an opsin that can absorb light and allow you to detect infrared light. And what's more, the infrared light would go into your eyeball anyway, and it was like building a camera out of glass. So for these reasons, it's hard to we can't, as animals, we can't see in the near infrared. Some snakes can see further into the heat radiation from further into the infrared, but animals can't see into the infrared for this very fundamental reason. There aren't any pigments in the infrared, so there's nothing to strongly absorb the light. So what happens when you move from the visible into the infrared? The light, in the visible, the light will enter your skin and it'll travel probably less than a millimeter and get absorbed by a pigment like hemoglobin. Okay. So you've lost it. The photons, it's been absorbed straight away. The first time it's...
So this is visible light.
This is visible.
It doesn't go in very far.
It doesn't go in very far.
Earlier you referred to, we need to pay attention to the longer waveform light, and that would be the infrared light. Is that
the near infrared
my understanding? Light. Okay.
It's just, in fact, it's the gap between the electronic transitions in molecules and atoms, and the vibrational and rotational transitions in molecules, which happen in the infrared.
Okay.
So there's a gap between where you get some vibrational transitions and you get very few electronic transitions, but basically there are not many things to absorb in the near infrared. Okay. And so the whole nature of the light, the photons in the body, changes when you get into the near infrared.
Okay. So earlier you were saying that we're just starting to understand how important the UV light is, and that's causing vitamin D to be made, and vitamin D is the proxy for sunlight. We can see visible light. We can see it hits the skin. It doesn't penetrate as far, but it causes a certain type of response. And now what you're saying is we also need to pay just as much attention to the infrared light, which we cannot see, and does different things to the UV light that are just as important. Very
different and just as important, yes.
Okay.
And the fact that we can't see it, I've just explained, it's your eyeball is a camera made out of glass, and there's nothing in your retina to absorb it. So, you can't see it. But
then people order red light therapy devices. They complain. They're like, "Oh, some of the lights aren't coming on," but those are the near infrared ones where you can't see. Okay, they're below our ability to monitor visually. Okay.
So that's the first very important thing, is the light behavior in the body in the near infrared is very different from the light behavior on our bodies in the visible.
Okay.
And this is why this is a good model, because although this is happening, this is highly colored in the visible because of scattering. The body is like this, but it's in the infrared. And so it allows light to get deep into itself, and it scatters many times on the way. So
and what are the biological implications of that scattering?
Well, I'll come to that in a moment, but let's just focus on this particular problem at the moment of the light getting into the body. I'm sure you've been into airports many times. When they let you into the airport, you have to go through the duty-free lounge. And in a big airport, there's often a zigzag path that goes for miles through all these shops and so on.
You need some perfume, you need some scotch.
You bounce off all of these different desks selling perfumes and whiskey and jewelry and watches and all of these things before you get into the airport. And that's what happens to photons coming in, infrared photons coming into your body. They go in and they have all these scatterers waiting for them in the body. These are the cell walls and the mitochondria. All these things are slight changes of refractive index of the material in the body, which interacts with light and bounces the light off into different directions. So a photon coming into your body bounces around between these cells and structures within cells many times before it actually buys something and gets absorbed.
Okay.
It's like a drunk in a car park, wandering around, bumping into lampposts.
Got a clear visual on that.
You
Yeah.
wander around and you bump into a lamppost, and then you wander around and you bump into the next lamppost, and so on. So you actually travel deep into the body before you've had a chance, because the absorbers are so weak. The chance of you getting absorbed by a molecule in the body is very low, but it's finite. So you scatter many times. You scatter as many times as you need until you get absorbed. So it's very similar to what happens in a leaf, but in a leaf, you don't have to scatter many times before you're absorbed by chlorophyll. In a body, you have to scatter many times before you're absorbed by a biomolecule.
Okay.
And
So
that
the
allows
UV
the
light
photons.
comes in more like a laser, like it just goes right in, it does its thing, whereas the infrared light is
Don't mention
bouncing,
lasers.
or don't mention lasers.
Don't
Okay.
mention lasers.
I know. I'm like, I just didn't use that word.
They're
Okay.
dangerous. They're dangerous for medicine, and they have characteristics which are, can be different. Now, it still happens in a leaf. Probably a photon will probably scatter several times before it actually gets to chlorophyll and is absorbed. But it doesn't have to scatter many times, just a few times.
Okay.
Whereas in the body, it'll scatter many times. In fact, I've done experiments where with many different forms of life, if you shine light into life, it will glow in the infrared. I mean, it's amazing. I have one of the bits of equipment I use in my office is an integrating sphere used for spectroscopy, which is a sphere in a box, which is very highly reflective. I mean, it's a perfectly white inside of a sphere. And if you shine light into this sphere, it'll bounce around many times before it gets absorbed, just like light in a body. And if I put, there's a port at the top where you can put something and you can measure the light being reflected from the object. If I put an insect, a nut, a leaf, my hand onto this integrating sphere, it will show me that the light is scattering many, many times in the material before coming out. In fact, if I put a mushroom on here, the white light coming out, it's a tungsten filament lamp, white light coming out, the whole mushroom will glow red like the setting sun, because the light is bouncing around in the mushroom many times before it's getting absorbed. And we realize now that one of the very important functions that the infrared performs is the process of reproduction in all of life. Reproduction is a very intensive and has very severe requirements for energy. You have to make sperm, you have to make eggs, you have to make seeds, you have to make nuts, and that's very energy expensive. And so many of these forms of life are using their infrared radiation to get deep within their structures and stimulate their reproductive processes to work much more effectively. In fact, if you look at a mushroom grows up into the forest understory as a sort of dome or a flat plate. It's linked to the mycorrhizal network underground, but it's the sporing body that comes up as a mushroom. And what this mushroom does, it collects light from the forest understory, from the leaves, the light scattered from the leaves, and transports it down into the spore-producing regions of the mushroom to build the spores to reproduce the mushroom. And it's the same for all of life. Nuts, I put a nut on this sphere and then the whole nut glows because it's using the infrared light. It's getting the infrared light deep within itself and it's using it for any energy-intensive processes. So, what I'm saying about humans today is also very true of basically all the forms of life that benefit from photosynthesis. They all are very effective harvesters of this infrared light.
And humans were evolved to be effective harvesters of this light for the same purposes?
Absolutely, all animals will be. I mean, think of reptiles that go out and early in the morning and sit on a rock and soak up the sun. It's a very common sight to see lizards, on a rock in bright sunlight. Now, everybody thinks they do that to warm up because they're cold-blooded. Well, that's true. There's nothing wrong with that. They do warm up. But really what they're doing is they're absorbing sunlight into their mitochondria to simulate their mitochondria to work better. So they gives them energy. It gives them the energy to predate or avoid predation on themselves and so on. So, this basking in the sun is an essential part of life, and very strongly illustrated by the reptiles, by the cold-blooded reptiles who go up into the light. But we think it's in the interactions of the infrared with the mitochondria, which is so important.
Okay, so would it be fair to compare mitochondria and what light does inside the human body with chloroplast and photosynthesis and what goes on inside the plants?
Well, yes. I mean, the fact that the chloroplast and mitochondria had very similar origins. In fact, they may have had identical origins, but one evolved into the chloroplast and one evolved into the mitochondria. But of course, plants also have mitochondria, they use the mitochondria to build themselves. So they actually need mitochondria to produce energy that they can use for performing all
their functions.
So they not only have chloroplasts, they also have mitochondria.
Okay, and we have mitochondria, but we don't have chloroplast. But we still, what I'm hearing is the sun is also an energy source for us in addition to food.
Yes, there's a very subtle point here.
Okay.
In chloroplasts, it's the energy of the solar photons that's being converted into chemical energy by photosynthesis. So the carbohydrates that are produced by plants are a relatively efficient way of converting solar photons coming directly from the sun into chemical energy. It's not super efficient, but it's efficient enough to generate this stuff. It's not efficient enough to allow the plants to walk around, unless they happen to be triffids. But it's it is in the case of photosynthesis, it's the energy is coming from the solar photons. In the case of the infrared and respiration and metabolism, it's not the energy that's coming from the photon. This is really important. Okay. It's not the energy that's coming from the photon. The photon energy is interacting with the mitochondria to make the mitochondria work better, but the energy is coming from the mitochondria burning the food. It's the combination of carbohydrates and oxygen in a slow burn that makes the energy, that makes the ATP and allows the cells to do their things. So this is a very important difference. In the case of the infrared and the photons coming into the region of the mitochondria, they are providing a different function. They're not providing the basic energy that drives your body. They're not providing the basic energy source. They're just making the mitochondria work much better.
Okay, so it's
a catalyst.
So our mitochondria needs that light to function optimally.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay.
And I in an hour we can't go into details, and we don't know all the details of how that actually happens. We're beginning to tease out some of the kind of interactions that will occur. I'll come on to that in a moment, because I want, as the second part of this. But just talking about the light getting into the body again, it's the first thing is that in the infrared, the process of the photon interacting with the biosphere is dominated by scattering. I call it a scattering-dominated process. In photosynthesis, the visible light getting into the chloroplast is an absorption-dominated process. So the photon getting into the leaf is far more likely to be absorbed than scattered many times. But the photon getting into the body is very unlikely to be absorbed unless it scatters many times. And it travels quite a long path inside the body, much longer than, if I shine photons, shine photons through my hand, the light getting in will scatter further than the thickness of my hand. And that means that those photons stay in the body for much longer than they would if they just traveled straight through.
I see. So they're all in there bouncing around for extended periods of time.
And this means that if you follow a parcel of photons coming in from the sun, so many photons per cubic centimeter, gets into the body, those photons, well, some of them will be reflected out, so you'll certainly lose some when it gets into the body. But inside the body, those photons will spend a long time in your body, relatively a long time in your body, certainly longer than they would if they just went straight through. That means the photon density in the body builds up because you're continuously feeding photons into the body. It's like blowing up a balloon, you have a balloon which is empty, and you blow into it and it gets bigger and bigger. What you're doing is you're pumping more photons into your tissues, and they're building up into what we call a photon gas inside the body. And so the photon density in the body can be higher than the photon density of the light coming into the body. And
that's incredible. Okay, go ahead. Is there a level at which we're filled? We're good. We've had enough.
Well, there are losses.
And then what happens? Okay.
Well, that's the whole point. There are losses. It's like blowing into a balloon. A balloon doesn't have any leaks, which shouldn't have anyway. So you keep blowing into the balloon, it'll blow up. In our case, we have leaks because a photon deep in your hand has two choices. You can either escape out through the surface, and if it's deep in your body, it's hard. It has to scatter many times to reach the surface. Some will. Your hand will glow. You've seen the picture of my hand, presumably from Schwelt. The hand is glowing.
Yes.
An insect will glow, a nut will glow, a mushroom will glow in that same way in the infrared. They're all the same. But the other way out is to be absorbed, of course. And so the balloon of your body is leaking. It's leaking by absorbing the photons and taking them out of the photon gas. See what I mean?
Wow. Okay, so I just want to make sure I'm understanding. So the infrared light comes in, it bounces around, it optimizes the mitochondria, and it starts to fill the body and provide energy, the type of energy that we need for, say, reproduction.
It enables rather than provides. The photons don't provide it, they enable it to happen.
Bob, you're very, very specific. I really like this about you. Okay. Enables.
Yes.
All right. So it enables reproduction. So for our bodies to be functioning optimally and doing all of the processes that we'd like them to do without breaking down, we would, it sounds like, necessarily need to be filled up with these biophotons and have them bouncing around in there as much as possible.
Not all the time, because
not at night.
You can sit in the dark. You can sit in the dark and you'll still live. If you remained in the dark for a long time, months, you probably wouldn't live any longer. I mean, there are some animals that live in the dark, but they're highly adapted to doing that. They live very, very slowly, and their metabolism does work, but it works very, very slowly. But for most life forms, if you starve them of infrared radiation, they will work, but they'll work less efficiently. They'll work more slowly. They'll make you more susceptible to diseases and all of these things. They'll increase the rate of aging. So, in fact, I invented this term, which I think is actually quite a good way of describing it. If you starve the body of near-infrared radiation, you will eventually suffer from what I call 21st century scurvy. Now, we're all familiar with, scurvy in the days of sail, when exploring sailors set off to sail around the world. After in the absence of vitamin C in this case, they suffered scurvy after months. After 6 months. Now, the analogy with this process of near-infrared starvation is closer than we think. In fact, I think the timescales of development of the problems are similar. They're not days, they're not minutes, they're not hours, they're not even weeks, but they're probably months before you feel your body really begins to feel the effect of this near-infrared starvation. And that's because the interaction of the infrared light with your tissues, with the mitochondria and their support structures, like they call it the endoplasmic reticulum around the nucleus and nuclei of cells and so on, which support the mitochondrial operation. Some of the effects of the photons on the mitochondria will be essentially instantaneous, but not all of them. Some of them will be stored effects. And so, one of the things Glenn Jeffrey and his team have realized is that if you shine red light on an animal body, the effects will last for hours, days. I mean, typically in a human, the effects of infrared exposure will have a positive effect on the mitochondria, which will last 4 or 5 days. So that means that the infrared radiation must be producing some long-lived catalyst within the mitochondria and their support structures, which enables this injection of light energy to last for significant periods of time. And that's another point I want to make, is the kind of interactions that are happening inside the body will be many and various, and they'll have different characteristics. Some of them will be instantaneous, some of them will be longer lasting, and so on. Some of them will have different timescales. But the point is, and I think this is an important concept which is very astrophysical, but I think is perfectly applicable in this case. What's happening here is, if you imagine yourself standing in the dark or sitting in the dark, you've had a good meal the night before and you're sitting in the dark and you feel you may have indigestion, but you're feeling perfectly comfortable. Your body is working fine, okay? And you're in a state of homeostasis, as they call it. Can I use that word for your audience? It's the stable.
Sure, you might want to just quickly explain it.
Well, when your body is in a stable state, you have a constant temperature, unless you have a fever, but you have a temperature which is constant within relatively narrow range. And what's going on inside your body? You have all these processes going on inside your body which are maintaining your body temperature at 37 degrees centigrade, 310 kelvins, the absolute temperature scale. But your body is maintained at a constant temperature. Let's leave it at that for the moment. And it's working. You're digesting food, you're respiring, you're breathing, your oxygen is being used to process food and making ATP. And that's all fine for limited periods. But if you've been a nurse working in on night shifts in a hospital in LED lit wards for many weeks without having much time in daylight, you will begin to suffer from this. And we know that the astronauts on the space station who stay there for, the papers published on this, they stay on the space station for months, 6 months, longer on the space station. And they've had very extensive medical tests carried out on them. Also, the experimental animals that go up onto the space station, they also feel the effects of this 21st century scurvy, as I call it. They suffer, we believe, infrared starvation, because you may be up in space, but you certainly don't see the sun directly. You certainly don't see the whole
No.
solar spectrum. You're lit with white LEDs. There
Yeah,
may
I
be
was
a
going to say, and I'm sure the whatever you're living inside is lit up with all kinds of
well,
light,
yes. I mean,
circadian unfriendly light bulbs.
well, no, there is a circadian system. I mean,
Yeah.
they changed the lighting on the space station in 2012. I think they have LED lighting, but they changed the color temperature and the brightness on the circadian cycle. But all of this lighting is infrared dark. There's no infrared.
There's no infrared.
No infrared.
So they're
And
being
whenever they
completely
see,
starved of infrared up there.
they're completely, I
Okay.
think, well, I'm sure NASA would tell me if I were wrong, but I don't think they ever see the infrared from the sun. You know, all their ports, all their windows are heavily shielded from
Yeah.
ultraviolet and probably the infrared radiation from the sun as well. So I think in general, their environment is infrared starved. And it's certainly true of other, other operations on the planet. You know, there are sailors who live in ships without portholes. There are
Right.
submariners who live,
Yeah.
in ships without portholes, and the portholes are no good anyway.
And
So
what about people? I was talking to someone and she was saying how she's like, my dermatologist tells me to wear SPF, but I don't need to because in the winter I get in my car in my garage and I drive to work and I get out of my car in the underground garage and I take the elevator up and I'm not outside at all.
yeah.
And this is not uncommon in a place where the winters are harsh and we've built all of these ways
yes.
around it, ways to avoid going outside. So
Yes. I have colleagues who work in Tromsø in Norway, and I asked them, what do they do in the winter when it's dark for 3 or 4 months? And of course, they have wood fires. They have wood burning stoves.
Right.
And they get
Infrared
plenty
heat.
of near infrared from those. I think that's a lifesaver for them. If they didn't have those, they would be in real trouble. So, you know, this is why Eskimos can survive in the Arctic Circle, because they burn blubber, you know, they burn. So they have access to infrared light.
Right.
And
So yeah,
so
most
if you want,
traditional cultures in cold places do have some kind of practice around heat and fire.
exactly. And if
Right.
you
Okay.
hadn't, you wouldn't be there because you wouldn't
Yeah.
survive. So yes,
So what are we doing when we're just inside all winter?
well, we're suffering. I mean, we're much more liable to catch viruses. And, you know, talk to Roger about this. I mean, I'm Roger Schwelt. I
Yeah.
mean, we
I
are
did.
much more vulnerable in the winter than we are in the summer. We know that. And that's largely, I would believe, because we are, in general, infrared starved. I mean, not everyone is infrared starved in the winter, but it's very easy. I mean, another example is the people who live in desert regions in cities, the skyscrapers in the Near East, you know, in Saudi Arabia and the Arab countries. It's a very hostile environment out in the sun, and the rich people there go from their skyscrapers, which have infrared rejecting glass in the windows and white LEDs inside illuminating. They go from their skyscrapers into their air-conditioned cars, and they don't expose themselves to the sun at all, I don't think. And look at the rate of diabetes in Saudi Arabia. The last statistic I looked at, 36% of people in Saudi Arabia have type 2 diabetes. It's huge.
Wow. Wow. It's true. I mean, we think of staying inside to escape the cold, but yes, even in places like Arizona,
Yes.
it's in the warmer months that you have these effects because everyone
Yes.
stays inside with the air conditioning.
Yes. And this is, you see these anomalies in the latitude dependence of diseases and so on. You find that people in Spain and Italy suffer much more from lack of sunlight than the people in Scandinavia who go out in the winter and, you know, they walk around under the sky and so on.
Because infrared light is available all day in every season.
Yeah.
Unlike the light that makes vitamin D, we have access to infrared light.
Actually,
at all times.
In the high latitudes, you do get some vitamin D coming indirectly, not from the sun itself, but it scatters in the atmosphere above you and comes vertically down through the ozone layer, and it can give you a few percent of what you would get from the sun just by coming down from the zenith.
Oh, that's incredible. I didn't know that.
Even without direct, there's very little coming directly from the sun because it's so low in the sky. But because that light is traveling tangentially through the ozone layer, which is absorbing all the ultraviolet. But if you still have air above the ozone layer, and it goes up to 40 kilometers, so the air scatters a little bit of the light down directly through the ozone layer, which is the same as the sun being in the zenith and coming straight down. So you do get some light from the zenith. So they don't suffer complete starvation if they go outside during the winter.
If we go outside.
Yeah, if we go outside. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So what I'm saying, just to summarize what I'm saying here, is what's happening is, the light is getting into your body because of this scattering dominated process. There's also a much more subtle and probably much more efficient scattering process, which is all the interaction of light with all the nanostructures in your body, all the small scale structures, the elements in the cells and so on. That acts as a kind of light trap, an extra light trap, which traps the light near the mitochondria and gives it an even greater chance of being absorbed. This is a very interesting topic that I certainly don't have time to go into, but we know a lot about the nanostructures in animals and plants. All these structural colors you see in butterfly wings and vivid iridescent beetles and so on, these are produced by nanostructures. They're not produced by pigments alone. They're produced by nanostructures. And the inside of your body is full of nanostructures. And the cells themselves are nanostructures. And the mitochondria are nanostructures. And the light is interacting with those structures and trapping them and in a way leading the light into these regions where they're trapped and giving them an extra opportunity to interact and be absorbed. So there's a very elegant process, scattering dominated process, the light getting into your body and being trapped in a way that it's absorbed and can perform its function, even though the absorptions are very, very weak compared to the pigment absorbers in the visible. So as I say, it's an entirely different kind of process. And the end result is that the light getting into these regions reaches what I call a radiative equilibrium with the sun. So the solar atmosphere is emitting these photons of sunlight, and they're getting very diluted by all the distance they have to travel to the Earth. They're going off in all directions. So by the time they reach your body, they've been highly diluted, but they've come from a body which is 6,000 degrees in temperature, the solar atmosphere. And so those photons actually contain very significant amount of energy, even though they're infrared photons. They're usually considered low energy photons. Those photons that are being absorbed in your mitochondria, say, they contain much more energy than the energy contained in the biomolecules bouncing around. The kinetic energy of a biomolecule is enough to heat the heat associated with this kinetic motion of molecules is enough to stimulate molecular interactions, chemical reactions between biomolecules. But that heat is a relatively wimpy source of energy. If you have an infrared photon, it contains something like 40 times as much energy as the kinetic energy of motion of a molecule. So it's a much bigger, but it doesn't heat your body because there are rather few of these photons. But if that photon excites a biomolecule into an excited state, in a way, it's like heating that biomolecule to a temperature which is much hotter than it would vaporize. Or it would certainly destroy the biomolecule as a biomolecule. But that energy from that infrared photon has excited it and left that energy there, and that the molecule can use that energy in various ways, including interacting with another biomolecule. So it effectively elevates the temperature. It's not a kinetic temperature, it's a radiation temperature. It elevates the temperature that allows biological chemical interactions to occur much more easily. So it lifts you're sitting in the dark, a lot of the chemical interactions which would happen between your biomolecules are inhibited because there's not quite enough energy. They would work better if it was hotter, but if it was hotter, they'd kill you. So you're trapped in the dark. But when you walk into sunlight, you suddenly get these photons coming in, and they will establish a radiative equilibrium with the solar atmosphere, which is a very significant energy source, not in terms of its ability to heat you, but in terms of its ability to make your molecules more efficiently reactive. And I think this is the whole point of the story. It's a very different source of energy, and it means your homeostasis is changed. You have a kinetic homeostasis when you're in the dark. You're at the temperature of 37 degrees and your body's working fine. When you walk out into sunlight, you'll have this additional source of energy, which will influence your source of energy required for homeostasis. Your body will adjust to this. It won't heat up your body. Even the relatively small amounts of energy coming in won't necessarily heat up your body, but it's a different energy source that's available. And we think this different energy source is doing many things in your body, one of which is making the electron transport chain in the mitochondrion, which is then generating the cellular energy, the ATP, the adenosine triphosphate, that allows the cells to do all the things they do. What these photons are doing, they are allowing that electron transport chain to work better. It's almost like lubricating them. It's like having an engine, which is, you have to keep well oiled in order to work properly. If you don't have these near-infrared photons, you're not lubricating and cooling your engine properly. And so the mitochondria don't work as well. And if your mitochondria are not working so well, they'll do different things with the food. They won't be able to cope with the food input well enough to avoid sending food off to being stored as fat and so on. And they'll have a reduced ATP production rate. When you switch on this extra source of photon energy from the sun, you give this extra boost to the homeostasis, and you allow the electron transport chain to produce ATP faster. And do other things as well, I'm sure. This is not the only thing that it does. You see the point, and we've evolved to do this. Of course, this has been going on for humans. It's been going on for a million years or so.
Yeah, it's like
for the rest of life, it's like
a foundational requirement for the optimal function of our bodies.
So, in a nutshell, to plants we have photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the energy source. The sunlight is the energy source for doing photosynthesis. Now, we as parasites to plants eat the plants and we digest the plants. So we use that food energy to generate our ATP and perform that function. But we need the light to do that. So the near-infrared light is to respiration and metabolism the way visible light is to photosynthesis. So it's a mirror process of photosynthesis. It's running photosynthesis in reverse, in a sense. But it's as essential to respiration as sunlight is to plants. That's our belief.
Wow. So that really calls into question a lot of the dogma that we've been taught about the sun being dangerous.
Absolutely, yeah. In fact, I had a conversation with a dermatologist who was treating my wife the other day, and we talked about sunlight, and I said, well, I assume you tell people not to go in the sun. No, he says, no, I encourage people to go into the sun because there are all these studies that show, people live longer when they go in the sun, and they suffer less skin cancer when they're out in the sun and so on. And so, some of the enlightened ones do know this.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear.
But the thing is that there's going out in the sun.
Yes.
If you go out and sunbathe and soak yourself in sun, that's not what you want to do. If you go out clothed in the sun with a hat, Scott was talking about this. I know, I heard him.
Yeah.
put your straw hat on and wear clothes. You can protect yourselves from the ultraviolet and the blue perfectly well.
Yes.
But the infrared will go straight through. So, the best place you can possibly sit for your health is in the shade under a tree in sunlight.
Amazing.
And that's why
we spend so much money and so on all of these complicated health interventions. We just go and sit in the shade of a tree.
And you feel it. You feel. I mean, you do that, and you feel good. You're protected from all the heat from the sun, and you look. It's wonderful. You feel terrific, and and you're getting all this infrared coming down. The leaves scatter infrared so efficiently that there is, if you look at the leaves in infrared light, they're as bright as a white cloud in sunlight. They can be brighter because they don't need all of this infrared light. They need a little bit of infrared for their mitochondria, but they don't need the infrared light.
And so they're just sparking it back out. Okay.
Yeah, they get rid of it as quickly as they can. They give it to us. So in the forest.
So you have a special camera that can capture infrared light, and you take a picture of a tree, and it's like the tree is a giant cloud of infrared. Is that what you see in the photo?
It's as white as a cloud.
Oh, that's amazing.
I've got many of those on my Flickr site, many of those pictures, but you often see color infrared pictures showing vegetation as red. But actually, if you do it doesn't mean anything, the red. Well, it is red, it's infrared light. But if you show a black and white picture of a tree in sunlight, it's incredibly bright.
Wow.
I've got pictures in the Herschel Society article, which is on the Herschel website. Which
I'll make sure to link to that.
Yeah, that's
because it's really amazing. I mean, to think that the trees are a source of infrared.
Yes, very efficient. And in fact, we tell the architects to plant trees outside their north-facing windows, because if the trees get in sunlight, even if the light doesn't get into the windows directly, the trees will radiate the infrared light in, except that they now have infrared absorbing glass in the windows, which is another problem.
I was going to say, has anyone made glass that you're aware of that lets the infrared through?
Well, yes. In Britain, almost all the houses have infrared transmitting glass. It's very rare to have infrared absorbing.
Right, because you want to heat up.
It's really a problem in big buildings.
Right.
For skyscrapers, for thermal control, you have to have infrared rejecting glass. But glass. Excuse me, glass is a problem.
Right. Okay, so just to wrap up, I did want to come back to what you were explaining to me just before we started with the nebulae and your observations on the thermal equilibrium and the nebulae and the biosphere, and back to our living web of Gaia.
Right. Yes. Well, it's a very analogous system. The interaction of starlight with an interstellar nebula, which I'm sure all of your audience have seen or will be able to see by looking at the Hubble and the James Webb's websites. The most beautiful things. The way that light interacts with the nebula, I think, is the way that the light is interacting with our bodies and with the biosphere in general. And that is, the photons are coming in and they are eventually, they are scattering and being absorbed. And the effect of that absorption is to excite a molecule to a given excited state. And that will have an effect on the molecule, but it will also decay, eventually emitting heat. And so, all of those different pathways with different molecules can be calculated in principle. And that's what we do in astronomy. If we have a nebula around, we have simultaneous equations, maybe tens of thousands of simultaneous equations, which account for the energy level populations of all these different atoms and molecules in the nebula. And they're all solved on computers, simultaneously. It's a huge simultaneous equation solution problem. And we call them photonization models. They're used in astronomy. They're used in nuclear fusion research, where you're studying these very hot plasmas. The way they model those plasmas is by using these photonization models. And they're data-rich models. They have all the numerical characteristics of all the transition probabilities of all the electronic states in the atoms and so on. But in a sense, it's a complex but straightforward process to solve all these. We need to do a biology like this now. I think we need to have a knowledge of the way that all these individual molecules can be excited by the infrared photons. We need to know the rates at which they happen, and we need to know how these molecules decay and how they emit heat in the end and so on. So it's a very analogous process, I think. I don't think at the moment this is done, but it's not impossible to do. And I think we'll gain a much deeper understanding into the whole process of life if we can understand this in some detail. Now, we've studied one or two particular cases, particularly the very interesting case of oxygen, because oxygen has a very interesting energy level structure. And you've heard of, and you've discussed many times in your podcast, reactive oxygen states. Now, you can actually excite ordinary triplet oxygens, called triplet oxygen, because the normal ground state is a triplet state quantum mechanically. I mean, you must be fluent in quantum mechanics. You're running a quantum mechanical website.
Hardly.
Anyway, the ground state of the oxygen molecule is a triplet, and that's relatively unusual for molecules. And normally molecules have a singlet ground state. But oxygen is unusual in having a triplet. And if you use infrared photons to excite an oxygen molecule into a low-level excited state with an infrared photon, which you can do, that is a singlet oxygen. And singlet oxygen is highly reactive. And it can be dangerous. This is what you need antioxidants for, to get rid of the reactive oxygens.
Yeah.
So photons can excite normal oxygen into a singlet state, which is a reactive oxygen state. Now, I think it was a mistake to think that's always dangerous. It can be extremely beneficial under some circumstances. And I think this is one of the channels by which infrared light is having a very profound effect on the state of molecules in our bodies. It is allowing the excitation of triplet to singlet oxygen, and that singlet oxygen is playing a role in signaling. It's playing many roles in metabolism, but it has to be controlled. I mean, that singlet oxygen can be converted into other reactive oxygen species. And I think, this is a hypothesis, I think the infrared light is, in some sense, choreographing or orchestrating the reactive oxygen state in the body. It's controlling. You've heard from Scott Zimmerman that it seems that infrared light is stimulating the production of melatonin, which is the father of all antioxidants. And I think one of the roles of the infrared light is to choreograph the balance of the reactive oxygens in the mitochondria in such a way that it doesn't get out of hand one way or the other. It's not starved and it's not over populated by reactive oxygens. So I think it's like it's a conductor. It's conducting the state of oxidants and antioxidants in the life process. Now that's a hypothesis. You go and talk to a medic and they'll probably think I'm completely nuts. But I think this is the kind of thing we have to think about.
Yeah.
The light is playing a very fundamental role in the processes. The very fundamental role is the energy that it gives to the molecules, which is a very special kind of energy, not just thermal energy. It's a very special kind of energy, which it can use in these different ways. And one of them is to create a singlet oxygen. In fact, I can't publish it yet because I need somebody to confirm it, but I can see the absorption of from the ground state of oxygen to a singlet state in my hand using this as an energy source. I can see the absorption line. And this absorption line is extremely well known in astronomy. It's called the Fraunhofer A and B bands. We see these in sunlight, and they were discovered by Fraunhofer in the 19th century. And this is one of the absorption lines which is not produced in the sun, but it's produced in the Earth's atmosphere during its transit through the Earth's atmosphere. And so, and this absorption is 100,000 times weaker than a typical atomic absorption. But there's still enough path through the oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere to show that absorption line very strongly. You see it in all the spectra of sunlight through the Earth's atmosphere. And I can see this being generated in my hand, which must mean that I'm generating singlet oxygen deep in my body, in my hand. Now, if I can confirm this and we can, convince referees that it's a real detection, I am a very experienced I've been doing spectroscopy for 50 years, and I'm pretty confident that I can do it. But we need to do more work on this. I do this all in my study at home. So I don't have a big lab. I don't have any funding. I don't have a big lab, but I'm doing all this. And this is one of the kinds of interactions I'm talking about. And I think there are many of them other than just this one. But it is making the people in the Gaia Foundation seminars got very excited by this idea that you can actually generate singlet oxygens using photons. And I think it's very interesting.
Wow. And that would be a milestone in terms of a more widespread acceptance that light is foundational to life and that perhaps quantum physics is required to explain biology.
Well, quantum physics is, of course, required for biology. It's silly to say this, because everything to do with atoms and molecules is quantum mechanics. So this is I get really fed up with people saying, is quantum mechanics required to understand biology? Of course it is, because the whole thing is quantum physics. Of course it is. And, this is maybe simple quantum physics, it's just excitation of atoms, but there's quantum tunneling. Talk to Jim Al-Khalili, there are many things going on which are very subtle. This is a very basic quantum mechanical process. The very fact that I call this a singlet state and a triplet state is quantum mechanics.
Right.
But it's bread and butter to astronomers to talk about this, but it's not bread and butter to biologists, I think, perhaps.
Yes.
Except
which is why your perspective and your experience is,
I think so, yeah.
Going to break ground in this area.
Yeah. But it's going to be complicated. It's going to demand many PhD theses to understand the details of all of this. But I think the basic point is, just to recap and remember, it's the homeostasis, the influence on the homeostasis of the body when it's in presence of sunlight is the important thing. It's a radiative contribution to homeostasis. Normal homeostasis is what we call a dynamic kinetic stability. Homeostasis is dynamic. We're not in thermodynamic equilibrium. We're very far from it. But we're in a dynamic, i.e. controlled state of kinetic stability. And when we go into sunlight, we're in a dynamic radiative stable state. So it's a radiative as opposed to a kinetic state of stability. And they're very similar to one another, but they have very different characteristics. And I think for normal life, we need both of these.
Right.
So I think that's the point. It's having two of these together. And they change. The balance between them changes all the time. This is what the circadian rhythm is, in my view. It's the swap from the purely kinetic stability we get in the dark, and the combination of kinetic and radiative stability we get in the daytime. We have to adapt to this, and that is the circadian cycle,
right?
In my view.
Oh, I love that view. This is so exciting. I really, I think we're just alive during a very interesting time
Mm.
in terms of our understanding. And especially since there's been so much damage done with our attitude towards the sun, this is really life-saving
Yes,
work that you're doing.
I think the message I would like to give is, yes, still treat the sun with great respect, I think, but, you can quite happily go out into the sun. I mean, when I go out in the sun, I put my hat on because I don't want skin cancer.
Yeah, and for the vitamin D, I mean, 20 minutes is probably good in the UV, I find.
Oh, yeah.
And then you just, put on a hat, put on a shirt, go in the shade.
Well, clothes, modern clothing is quite good at protecting you against UV. I mean, and so you can be perfectly comfortable. And in fact, as Scott has pointed out many times, I don't know if he's pointed out to you, I mean, blocking just the UV with sun blocker and then going out into the sun with just UV blocking sunblock is doing you more harm than good, because it's giving you confidence to be in the sun when actually the damage is being done by the longer wavelengths, which are not. I think modern sunblockers are beginning to block the longer wavelengths as well. But you can have a false sense of security wearing sunblock. I think that's very dangerous.
Right. So just to wrap up, how has studying all of this changed your worldview, your view of humans, our place in the cosmos?
It's given me a lot more respect for evolution. The things I didn't have in astronomy was evolution of life.
Right.
Now I'm much more alert to the amazing developments that have been achieved by time and evolution. 3.5 billion years of evolution has invented the most amazing physical, chemical, biological processes, which we're way behind in understanding all of these things. I mean, I recently had to look at a paper on studying nanostructures in animals and plants, and the biomimetics of that to produce engineering structures for cooling solar panels and cooling buildings and so on. The number and sophistication of nanostructures in plants and animals is just staggering. And they're used with gay abandon by the evolutionary process in animals. I mean, some animals, they mix together, match and mix 6 or 7 wonderful different physical processes to provide, their form of life. And we're just beginning to tease out all of these processes and begin to understand how they work. When I worked on the radii, this idea of a photonic tapetum, a photonic reflector in the eye, that was very simple. I mean, it was the simplest possible nanostructure. But in life, we have inside our bodies, we have all these nanostructures which are interacting with light in very sophisticated ways that we certainly haven't yet all figured out, or all of them. But lots of exciting things to do, but I'm absolutely sure they're all there. They just need to be teased out.
Exciting work to come. Well, thank you for getting the ball rolling. It's really a great contribution that you're making.
Thank you. And I just mentioned, as I mentioned to you before we started, this extends to the whole process of getting rid of the energy coming from light, excreting the waste products of the light going through the body, which is heat. And we actually radiate that out into space. And if we're inside buildings, we can't do that so effectively. So it's another reason for going outside. We can radiate our excess heat, the end product of this wonderful transport of solar energy through the biosphere gets radiated as heat into outer space. So for us, it's important to have a channel there where we can radiate our heat effectively.
So what is the benefit of that to us?
Well, I think, I think the literature that I read suggests that we get rid of about half of our body heat by radiation. We're unusual animals in that we sweat, so we can use evaporative cooling. Not all animals can do this, but we're still radiating half of our heat into space. And the cooler the surrounding space and a clear sky is very cool. I said to you, a clear sky, if you measure the temperature of the clear sky with a radiative thermometer, it's at about minus 40 degrees centigrade. So that's a very good surface to radiate to. So when you're sitting under your tree in the shade of the sun, if your body sees the blue sky around you, you will feel cool because you're radiating your heat to the blue sky. If it's cloudy, it won't work so well, but you won't be so hot anyway. So
okay, so that's an important function for the body to let that heat then go, and it's not done as efficiently when we're inside.
Yeah, right. And the whole thing, from photons entering the biosphere to photons being excreted at the end in the biosphere, is all wonderfully coupled to the way the planet works.
Right.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary. We need to spend more time outside. That's my takeaway at the
Absolutely.
end.
I've hardly mentioned a lamp at all.
Yes, it's true. Oh, we have the lamp in the sky. Bob, thank you so much for being here. I would love to do this again sometime after give everyone a chance to process and digest this first dose, and to stay updated on the amazing work that you and Scott Zimmerman and Glenn Jeffries and so many people are doing. It's it's important on many levels. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for the chance, and it's very nice to talk. And we should keep in touch, and it's going to be very exciting. If I had another career.
Well, you're spending so much time in Fred Light. Maybe you will.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Meredith. Thank you very much indeed. Okay.
Woohoo! You made it to the end of another episode. Thank you so much for joining us on this exploratory adventure into new realms. Your energy and support are building a different world, and I am so grateful to be on this journey with you. Take care, and thanks.